When little Galoshes was in the house, he wore little brown shoes. But whenever he put on his little blue coat, and his little red cap, and his little red woolly mittens, and started out the door, his mother called to him. "Put on your little galoshes," she said. And he always did. Then he hopped up and ran out into the barnyard. He went squeak 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 if it was snowy. And squish 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 if it was muddy. And if the ground was frozen hard, he went clunk clunk clunk. But whether he went squeak, squish, or clunk, his little galoshes flapped and the buckles tinkled. Everybody in the barnyard could hear him coming. The chickens clucked up to him and said, "Hello, hello, hello, little Galoshes." And the ducks waddled along behind him. "What are we going to do today, little Galoshes?" they quacked. The pigs squealed when they heard him coming. "The little pig is caught in the fence again, little Galoshes," they called. "Please get him out, little Galoshes," called the pigs. Little Galoshes pulled the fence boards, and he pushed the little pig until it could squeeze back into the pen. The chickens and the ducks, and especially the pigs, cried, "Hooray for little Galoshes!" And little Galoshes brushed off his mittens and skipped into the barn. The horse rubbed her ear on his little red cap, and the colt pranced round and round him. "Did you bring our sugar, little Galoshes?" they asked. Sometimes he laughed and said, "Yes," and gave them sugar right away. And sometimes he frowned and said, "No," and hid the sugar in his pocket. The horse and colt looked so disappointed, that little Galoshes dug down deep in his pocket and gave them each 2 lumps instead of 1. The cow mooed softly when he went to her stall. "Did you like the milk sent you for your breakfast, little Galoshes?" she always asked. And when little Galoshes said yes, he did, she mooed a happy moo. The calf switched his little tail. "I like milk for breakfast, too," he said. And then the goat peeped into the barn. "Are you ready to play?" she asked. "Yes," said little Galoshes. He was always ready to play with that little goat. Sometimes they raced, sometimes they hid. Sometimes they just ran around the barnyard making loud noises. But whatever they played, it was a long game that took all morning. When it was time for lunch, the little goat walked back to the house with little Galoshes. And then one day, little Galoshes woke up very early. He got out of bed and ran downstairs. There was no one in the kitchen, because his mother was still asleep. "I know what I'll do," he said. "I'll go out in the barnyard and surprise everybody by being so early." He buttoned up his little blue coat, and he put on his little red cap. He pulled on his little red woolly mittens. And he opened the door. Nobody said, "Be sure to wear your little galoshes," because his mother was still asleep. So little Galoshes went out into the barnyard without his little galoshes. He ran straight to the hen yard and called, "Good morning," to the chickens. But the chickens only looked at his muddy shoes and winked at each other. They turned their backs and not one of them said, "Hello, hello, hello, little Galoshes." The ducks made believe they didn't recognize him, either. They set up a dreadful quacking when they saw him. They flapped their big wings and waddled away as if they were afraid. "I wonder what's the matter," said little Galoshes. Then he heard the pigs squealing, so he ran to the pig pen. "The pigs will be glad to see me," he thought. But the pigs pretended they weren't glad to see him at all. "Go away," they squealed angrily. And they rushed toward him looking so cross and fierce. Then he ran into the barn and hid behind the door. He heard the cow mooing in her gentle way, and he heard the horse talking to her colt. "I wonder if little Galoshes will bring us some sugar today," she said. Little Galoshes peeped out from behind the door. "I did bring you sugar," he called out happily. But the horse only looked at his muddy feet. "We don't want sugar from strange little boys," she said. And the calf made believe he was angry. He pushed him out from behind the door. "Go away," he cried. "Go away. We don't know you." We don't want strange little boys in. Little Galoshes went scrambling out into the barnyard. I'm not a strange little boy, he called. I'm Little Galoshes. And then the goat came out of her house. Oh, no you're not, she cried, with a twinkle in her eyes. We know Little Galoshes when we see him. She put down her head. She rushed forward on her quick little hoofs. And she bumped Little Galoshes with her hard little head. Even my goat doesn't know me, whispered Little Galoshes. Nobody knows me anymore. He ran away from the little goat. He ran across the muddy barnyard as fast as he could run, and he pulled open the kitchen door and burst into the kitchen. His mother was standing at the stove stirring the oatmeal. It smelled very good. She smiled at Little Galoshes. And then she looked at his feet. They were so wet and muddy that she frowned. My goodness, she said, did you go out without your little galoshes? I forgot, gulped Little Galoshes. He took off his wet shoes, and he put on his dry slippers. He sat down near the stove, and ate his breakfast. That made him feel a little better. But not much. His mother gave him dry shoes. She buttoned him into his little blue coat, and snuggled him into his little red cap. She slipped his little red woolly mittens on his hands. Then she told him to go out and play. Little Galoshes went slowly toward the door. And his mother said, now don't forget to put on your little galoshes. So he put one galosh on one foot, and the other galosh on the other foot. He opened the door and went out into the big barnyard again. He went squishing through the soft mud. His little galoshes were flapping and tinkling in the merriest way. But Little Galoshes wasn't merry. He felt puzzled and lonesome. He crept into the woodshed and sat on a log. I wish it were yesterday, he sighed. I had a lot of friends yesterday. And then he heard the chickens cackling outside. Those chickens were calling him. Little Galoshes, they were calling. Little Galoshes. Where's Little Galoshes? The big ducks were waddling back and forth. Little Galoshes, they quacked. We heard Little Galoshes. And the pigs were looking for him, too. Where is Little Galoshes? They squealed. Little Galoshes wiped his eyes and smiled a happy smile. Here I am, he cried. I'm right here. Good, 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 clucked the chickens, peeping in at him. It's Little Galoshes. Come on out to the barn, the ducks quacked. Everybody's looking for you, squealed the pigs. So Little Galoshes tinkled and flapped out to the barn, with the chickens and the ducks and the pigs dancing around him. We thought you'd never come, said the 0000000 horse. And the colt cried, a strange little boy did come, he said he was Little Galoshes. But he didn't fool us, squealed the pigs, because you always wear little galoshes in the winter time, the goat cried. And he had no little galoshes. Little Galoshes opened his eyes very wide. He made his mouth into an O. And then he said, how will you know me in the summertime? That's easy, shouted all the animals together. We know you in summer by your little pink toes. Little Galoshes looked down at his little galoshes. He wriggled his 10 warm, snug, little pink toes. And he looked at all his good friends, who were crowding close to him and smiling. He smiled, too, and then he laughed. So that's it, he cried. So that's it. Well, I'll never come out in the winter again without my little galoshes. And he skipped out of the barn. He ran all around the barnyard going squish, squish, squish in the soft mud. His galoshes went tinkling.